Alright, so I am back once again, and this time I'm reviewing another lens that's sort of atypical. Instead of a Nikon lens, this is one made by a company called YK Optics or Yokohama Optics. This one in particular is branded as an Avenon, but some of them are branded as Cobalux, and I think a couple of other small, pretty obscure brands. And this is actually a lens that was made in the screw mount, the Leica screw mount or Legacy screw mount. I think it's also sometimes called the R39 screw mount because it's roughly 39 millimeters. I don't really have a great camera to shoot this on. Well, I technically do, but I'm going to get to that in a whole nother video. But when I bought this lens, it did come up with an Avenon branded screw mount to Leica M mount converter. So I bought a Leica M mount to Sony E mount converter and mounted it on my Sony Alpha 7. And that's actually what I'm shooting this video on right now. So unfortunately, I can't really show it to you mounted on a camera, but this is you know, how I shot it, and that's how I got the images. So all these images were actually shot on digital, but again, I have an option to shoot this on, but it's something I just recently got, and I haven't really been able to shoot a lot of film on it. Boy, it's really coming down out there. Well, regardless, I'll just keep going. I live in out in the desert, for those of you who don't know, so to see a rainy day like this is pretty rare. But regardless, I found this lens really interesting. It's not a super well-known brand or lens. They made this, the company made this particular lens, the 21mm f2.8, and then they made a 28mm f3.5. So both of them were wide-angle lenses. This one was obviously the higher-end option, being both wider and faster. They made corresponding viewfinders for both of them, which are gigantic. I have that, but again, I'll get to that later. And they also made a 35mm viewfinder, which there doesn't seem to be a corresponding lens for, but those are pretty rare. They made these adapters as well, and not much else. They existed in Yokohama, hence the name of the company, from the mid-80s into probably the early 2000s. So an interesting side note is that, as I said, this company was founded in the mid-80s, right about the same time that Komora went out of business. And it's believed that the one of the engineers from Komora founded the company known as Yokohama Optics, which made the Avenons and Cobalux lenses. And it's really interesting because when you look at it, again, Avenon has a pretty limited lens selection. One of their most common and probably most famous lenses is their 28mm f3.5. And Komora had a 28mm f3.5 that looked very similar. I don't have that option around now. It was also made in screw mount. I don't think it was made in any other mount. This, of course, is my 35mm f2.8 version in Nikon S mount. But I find it interesting that this company that I became somewhat enamored with kind of founded this company. And I don't know exactly how direct the connection is. I've really only found one piece of evidence that kind of suggests that, and that was retranslated over multiple sources. So I'm not exactly sure how accurate it is, but it seems pretty plausible. So anyways, this lens is pretty interesting. This is one of the two, the 21mm f2.8, which is surprisingly fast for such a wide-angle lens, especially from a generic manufacturer, but it is a decent-sized lens that has some weight to it. The elements are just huge and really curved. You don't see too many like that. And I gotta say, I tested this thing, and on the whole, I really liked it. I shot it all on digital on the Sony A7 that I'm shooting this video on. And I gotta say, it had really nice results. It's probably one of the nicer ultra-wide lenses I've really used, because if you remember in the past, I did have Cosina-made, Voigtlander-branded Helar Mark III, which is a 15mm f4.5 lens. So it was wider than this, but it was quite a bit slower. And I had that lens, and I kind of liked it a little bit, but once the sort of the newness of it wore off, I never really used it again. I actually had it a very similar mechanism where it was an M mount lens, and I had an M mount to E mount converter, and I shot it on my Sony A7. I actually sold the lens and got rid of the converter with it, which I kind of regret, because then I had to buy this converter to use this lens, which, you know, wasn't a huge hassle, but it wasn't you know, wasn't exactly the most efficient thing in retrospect. Interestingly, at the same time, I bought a Nikon F mount to Sony E mount adapter, so I'm shooting this video right here on my old 35 f2.8 lens that was technically a pre-AI lens that was modified for AI compatibility. And I gotta say, its results are pretty nice as well. I'm shooting at about f4 for this video, so that gives you an idea. And speaking of this lens, I'll just roll into showing you some sample images and footage. First of all, people ask about lens flare a lot, and I don't always get lens flare in my tests. I try my best to get 1 or 2 images with some lens flare, but it's kind of hard to predict and control. And then a lot of times it seems to render itself differently depending on what type of light it is and even what type of film it is. So I did a little test right here where I put it on the Sony A7, activated the video mode, and I just shined a flashlight in it and moved it around some so you can see that and make your own judgments. It does flare a fair amount, but then again, this is a pretty bright light being shined like directly into it, pretty close by, and it's also wide open. All this footage was at f2.8, so that's pretty wide open, which I think does increase your chances of flaring. As for the images, you'll see there's quite a few of them, well, a decent amount. And all in all, I think they look really nice. Comparing them to some other images I took on the trip with the Sony Zeiss 28mm f2 lens, which is another wide-angle lens. It's a similar speed. They look kind of different. Obviously, the Avenon is wider. But an interesting thing I noticed is the colors are notably different between the two different lenses. I don't know if I can really show you a good comparison, but I will say that there's a slightly more of a, I guess, a bluish tint on the Sony lens, and it's not hugely noticeable, but when you compare them side by side, you do notice there is kind of a different color science, for lack of a better term, to the two lenses, and it's not really easy to quantify because I noticed that the Avenon seems to do a lot better with shots that have the sky in them and clouds. It seems to just kind of expose them a little bit better and render, especially the clouds, a little bit better. It's not a huge difference again, but it is noteworthy. One of the great flaws of this lens I noticed, and I shot it wide open a fair amount of the time on this little road trip I was on where I shot all these photos. When it's shot wide open, it's not very sharp around the edges. I don't know if that's necessarily depth of field because I had it wide open at f2.8, or if it's just kind of the fact that the lens is not very sharp around the edges. In images where it is closed down, it does seem quite a bit sharper around the edges, but it does seem like it's not as sharp as the center, which really, if you're used to working with really wide angle lenses, you know that's pretty normal. That's nothing too out of the ordinary. It is kind of disappointing, but nothing too crazy or out there. Beyond that, I would also say that it doesn't really have any distortion around the edges. With these lenses, you generally expect some level of distortion, and I'm sure there's a tiny bit, but I really couldn't see it in any of the images. And there's images where there's like a light pole right at the edge where it should be pretty obvious. Another thing you might expect from a lens like this that's both wide and fast is some vignetting. And there were a couple of shots where it was very wide open that it does seem like there's just a little bit of corner vignetting. Which isn't really that bad, again, considering how wide the lens is. I mean, you can see similar vignetting on lenses that aren't nearly as wide, like 28mm, or I think even 35mm lenses that are in the same aperture speed of around f2.8, or maybe a tiny bit faster, like f2. So I don't think it's really anything that bad, or anything that really detracts from the image quality that much. And that's the thing I like about this lens, is that even the flaws, like the fact that it's kind of soft around the edges, it kind of adds to the character of the lens, and it gives it a very interesting feel. I can't help but feel that this, especially after shooting it with it on my A7, and this kind of might be my own bias, but I can't help but feel that this would be a really good lens to shoot video with, because, you know, it's wide, and I think a lot of times when you're shooting scenes in video, you want a wider lens, but it's also fast, so you can get kind of a depth of field. Granted, most of the depth of field I had was in the foreground, not really the background, which isn't really the way I like to shoot, but a lot of people do that. But anyways, I would like to try to get out more and shoot with this lens, especially with the lens flare. I found that really kind of interesting. It would be interesting to shoot some like dramatic scenes or like a music video with this lens. Now, granted, I don't think I'm going to do that because I don't have that many friends, and most of them aren't that talented, so that's probably not going to happen. But regardless, I found this lens very intriguing and interesting, and I think it warrants a lot more examination. And I will be doing a video later where I shoot it on a film camera, and I talk more about how it looks on film. I assume the results will be pretty similar, but I will be shooting on black and white film predominantly. I might get a roll or two of color in there, we'll have to see. But I think that'll be a pretty interesting comparison. So there's a pretty neat little lens for you. There's a couple of models, technically. I don't really know much about it, but some people claim there's one that focuses a little bit closer, and I know some of them are available in black. I did a little bit of research, but was not able to find much difference. I wasn't even able to confirm the fact that whether or not there's a version that focuses closer. Supposedly that one focuses at like 0.7 meters, so that would be around 2.5 feet, where this one it's 1 meter, 3.5 feet. Those could be exceptionally rare. They might not even be real. I don't know. But regardless, I like this lens. I like it. I'd like to learn more about it, and I'd like to get a few more lenses like this. I'd really love to try the Avenon or Cobalux 28mm lens, and I'd really like to try the Kimura one as well, because I've heard really good things about that lens. And granted, I think the two of them are pretty much the same lens, but regardless, I think it would be really interesting to try at least one of them, maybe even both of them, and compare it. But then again, I've been saying I'm going to compare all my 35mm lenses for like a year, and I haven't gotten around to that yet, but someday. So that's pretty much it for this video. It's my thoughts and a few sample images on the Avenon 21mm f2.8. Fairly unique and interesting lens, because once again, the only company I can think of who's made something quite like this for rangefinders would be Leica, and it's a much more expensive lens. Granted, I'm sure its quality is a little bit higher. It's almost 10 times more expensive than this lens. So if you're looking for a super wide or ultra wide option for a rangefinder, a classic camera, or even if you're willing to convert and use it on like a Sony or a Fuji camera, I think this is a pretty good one. They're not horribly expensive. You can usually buy the lens for itself in the $400 to $500 range, which, again, I mean, that's not exactly an insignificant amount of money, but for camera gear, that's really not much. So if you got the chance, I would definitely say try out one of these lenses, because it's kind of a hidden gem of the photography world. So that's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this video, and see you next time.